Literary theory. It's definitely one of those terms, isn't it? It can sound, I don't know, intimidating, abstract.
Maybe even irrelevant if you're not, like, deep in an English department somewhere.
Right. But what if? What if the ideas bubbling up in literary theory aren't just about analyzing novels or poems?
What if they're actually about changing how you see everything? Language, culture?
Even yourself. That's kind of the promise, or maybe the challenge of it.
Yeah. And this source material we have, Culler's book, it's packed with concepts that really push against our everyday assumptions.
Things we just take for granted.
So our goal today is to pull out some of the most, let's say, surprising ideas, maybe clarify some concepts that seem a bit tricky.
And really explore how these theories challenge what we often just call common sense.
We want to give you a feel for what literary theory is really about and, why people get so wrapped up in it, why it feels compelling, maybe even revolutionary.
Yeah, it's digging into the hidden structures, isn't it? How we make meaning, how things signify.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with, well, the word itself, theory.
Good place to start.
What does it even mean here? Because, out in the world, it gets used in so many different ways.
That's exactly where our source begins. Culler acknowledges that confusion right off the bat. We use theory for, say, established scientific principles.
Like the theory of relativity. That sounds solid. Proven. You wouldn't argue with it unless you're, Einstein.
Right. It feels like fact. The theory of gravity. It just is.
Apples fall down? Check.
Exactly. But then we also use it much more casually, don't we? My theory is the traffic was bad because everyone left early.
Right, like a hunch, a guess.
A speculation. And our source points out that theory, in the sense we're discussing today, literary or critical theory, it's somewhere in between those two.
In between?
Yeah. It's more than just a wild guess. It's systematic, it's complex, it considers multiple factors.
Okay.
But it's often not something you can easily prove or disprove in a lab, It's a structured way of thinking, a framework, even if parts of it are speculative.
Okay, so it's not just like here are 5 different ways to read Hamlet. It's not just a menu of interpretations.
No, it's usually something bigger than that. Though Culler does mention, there's often an appendix listing different schools of criticism, but theory itself is broader.
So what is it then, this bigger thing?
The most crucial point, according to our source, is that theory, in this academic sense, is fundamentally an interdisciplinary discourse.
Interdisciplinary, meaning?
It means it pulls ideas, concepts, methods, arguments from all over the place, not just literary studies.
Okay.
Think philosophy, linguistics, psychoanalysis, a big one, history, sociology, political theory, gender studies, science studies. It's a real mix.
So it's like a conversation happening across all these different academic fields.
Yeah.
People are borrowing tools and ideas.
Exactly. An insight that maybe originated in linguistics about how language works could become theory when someone applies it to understanding culture or history or literature.
Okay, I see. And what makes it theory is that it travels. It's useful outside its original home.
That's a huge part of it. These insights are seen as productive, suggestive, illuminating for people studying other things. They offer new angles on fundamental concepts.
And what kind of fundamental concepts are we talking about?
Really basic stuff when you think about it, like what is meaning? How does it work? Or the whole nature versus culture debate. How does the psyche operate? What's the difference between public and private experience? How do big historical forces interact with individual lives? Theory offers frameworks for tackling these huge questions.
Okay, so it's drawing from everywhere, applying everywhere, but you said the main effect, the real punch of theory, is that it messes with common sense.
That's the core claim our source highlights. Theory disputes common sense. It takes aim at the things we just assume are obvious, natural, the baseline reality.
Okay, give me an example. What common sense idea gets challenged?
A really big one. The idea that the meaning of what someone says or writes is simply whatever that person, the speaker or the author, had in mind when they said or wrote it.
That seems incredibly obvious.
Right.
Of course, the meaning is what the person intended. How else could it work?
Seems intuitive, doesn't it? But theory really complicates that. It suggests meaning is maybe more slippery, more dependent on the language itself, on conventions, on the context.
Yeah.
Maybe less tied to the author's private thoughts than we assume.
Okay. What else?
Another common sense notion that writing is just, a way of recording a thought or an experience that already existed before the writing.
Like I have an idea, then I write it down. The writing is secondary.
Theory questions that too. Or the idea that reality is simply what's present to us at any given moment. Solid, unmediated, just there.
Which, yeah, most of the time reality feels pretty present and immediate.
And that feeling is exactly what theory puts under the microscope. It argues that what we call common sense isn't some timeless, universal truth.
It's constructed.
Yes, it's a historical construction, a particular way of seeing things, a set of assumptions, basically, a theory itself that has become so widespread, so deeply ingrained, we don't even recognize it as a theory anymore. It just feels natural.
It's like the air we breathe. We don't notice it until something makes us aware of it.
That's a great analogy. Theory tries to make us aware of the air, the assumptions shaping our understanding. Our source uses Michel Foucault as a prime example of this critique.
Okay, Foucault. What common sense idea did he take on?
He famously challenged what he called the repressive hypothesis about sexuality.
The repressive hypothesis. That's the idea that, like, in Victorian times, sex was all hushed up and repressed, and now we're liberated and talk about it openly.
It's the standard story, yeah. Very common sense. Foucault flipped it.
Yeah.
He argued that sex, as this distinct object of knowledge, this thing to be studied, classified, managed, wasn't just some natural force waiting to be unleashed.
It wasn't just there being repressed.
No. He suggested it was actually produced by the explosion of discourses about it in the 19th century. All the talking, analyzing, categorizing by doctors, clergymen, legal officials, psychologists.
So all that talk didn't just describe sex, it kind of invented it, or at least our modern concept of it.
That's the core of his argument. As Culler puts it, these discourses claimed only to analyze or describe something pre-existing, but Foucault argues they were creatively productive. They created the very thing they were studying.
Wow, okay. That fundamentally challenges the idea that sex is just a natural thing.
It completely undermines the simple, repressed, liberated narrative. It shows how what seems natural can be the product of specific historical practices and ways of talking. That's theory challenging common sense.
So theory digs under the surface of what seems obvious. What about Jacques Derrida? Our source mentions him too.
Yes, Derrida offers another powerful example, focusing on language, specifically the relationship between speech and writing.
What's the common sense view there?
Traditionally, in Western thought, speech is seen as primary. It's immediate, present, the speaker's thought is right there. Writing is seen as secondary, a mere sign of a sign, potentially misleading, derivative.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Speech feels more alive. Writing is just marks on a page.
Right. And Derrida analyzes how this hierarchy plays out, for instance, in the work of Rousseau, who explicitly follows this common sense view. Rousseau called writing a dangerous supplement, even a disease of speech.
A supplement, meaning like an add-on, something extra.
Exactly. But Derrida digs into that word, supplement. Does it mean something that adds to something already complete, like an optional extra? Or does it mean something that completes something that was lacking, like a vitamin supplement?
Oh, that's ambiguous.
Very. And Derrida shows that while Rousseau says writing is just an inessential extra, his own writings, like his Confessions, reveal something different. Rousseau actually needed writing.
Needed it. Why?
Because speech, for him, wasn't transparent. His spoken words in social situations didn't convey his true inner self. He felt misunderstood. He needed writing to try and capture that inner truth, to compensate for the flaws and ambiguities of speech.
So writing wasn't just an optional extra for Rousseau, it was essential to make up for what speech lacked.
Precisely. It was acting as a second kind of supplement, completing something deficient. But then Derrida takes it further. He argues that speech itself is already a supplement.
Speech is a supplement? For what?
For the thing itself, for the pure thought or experience that it's trying to represent. Words are already standing in for something else. They aren't the thing itself.
Okay, so it's like a chain. Writing supplements speech, speech supplements thought.
Exactly. Derrida identifies what Culler calls a law of an endless linked series of supplementary mediations. There's no getting back to a pure, unmediated, original presence or meaning.
So that feeling of immediacy of the real thing is actually an effect.
Yes. The impression of immediate presence, the original, is actually deferred, produced by the chain of supplements, the copies, the signs. As Culler puts it, immediacy is derived.
That turns things completely inside out. Our common sense idea of reality being present and original just collapses.
It becomes untenable under this analysis. Experience is always mediated by signs. The original is an effect of those signs.
And this connects to Derrida's famous phrase, there is no outside of text.
Yes. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. It doesn't mean there's no reality outside books. It means when you try to grasp reality itself, separate from the signs and structures that allow us to think about it, what you find is more signs, more text, more chains of supplements. Our lives, our understanding are suffused with these mediating structures.
It's text all the way down, in a sense.
In a sense, yes. It highlights the mediated nature of all experience.
So Foucault shows discourses, producing what they describe. Derrida shows language creating presence through absence. These are powerful ways theory messes with common sense.
They are, and notice they do it differently. Derrida often works by closely interpreting texts, showing how literature itself can be theoretical. Foucault tends to offer broader historical frameworks for understanding how discourses of knowledge operate and produce their objects.
The source even throws in an Aretha Franklin example, natural woman.
Right. Just briefly, to show how theory questions the natural. The feeling of being a natural woman might feel inherent, but theory suggests that feeling itself is produced culturally through discourses about gender, biology, femininity, and so on.
So it's questioning the feeling of naturalness itself.
Exactly. So, to sum up the characteristics of theory based on this. 1, it's interdisciplinary.
Drawing ideas from everywhere, affecting fields outside its origin.
2, it's analytical and speculative. It rigorously thinks through the implications of concepts like sex, language, meaning, the subject.
Digging into what's involved.
3, it's a critique of common sense, challenging concepts we take as natural or obvious.
Pointing out the glasses we didn't know we were wearing.
And 4, it's reflexive. It's thinking about thinking. It questions the very categories we use to understand the world.
Okay, but the source also acknowledges this stuff is hard. It can be intimidating.
Definitely. Culler mentions theorists like Lacan, Foucault, Spivak. There's just so much. You can never feel like you've mastered it all. It's potentially endless.
So it requires a different kind of commitment.
Yeah, an open-ended one. A willingness to keep reading, keep questioning, acknowledging there's always more to learn, more connections to make. But the payoff is that it helps clarify the stakes, the implications of different ways of thinking.
Okay, so theory challenges our common sense about big things like meaning and reality. But what about the thing that seems like it should be most central to literary theory? Literature itself.
Right. After questioning everything else, what does theory say about literature? Does it even think that category matters?
You'd assume, right, that the absolute first question for literary theory would be, what is literature?
Seems logical, but our source hits us with a surprise. Theory hasn't always treated that as the most central question.
Really? Why on earth not?
Well, for a couple of key reasons, according to Culler. First, remember that interdisciplinarity we talked about?
Yeah, pulling ideas from everywhere.
So theorists might be analyzing texts from philosophy, history, psychoanalysis, whatever. If a philosophical argument by Hegel is useful for their thinking, they'll analyze that text using theoretical tools. The specific boundary of whether it's literature or not isn't always the main point for them.
They're following the ideas, not necessarily sticking within the literature box.
Exactly. And the second reason is related. Theory started finding what Culler calls literariness outside literature.
Literariness outside literature, what does that mean?
It means qualities or structures that were traditionally thought to be special or unique to literature started showing up as important in other kinds of texts and discourses, too.
Like what kind of qualities?
Well, think about narrative structure, how stories work, cause and effect, plot development. Our source points out that historians increasingly realize that understanding the past involves narrative models. Making sense of historical events often relies on structuring them like a story.
So the way we understand history uses tools we thought belonged to fiction.
To some extent, yes. Or consider rhetorical figures, metaphor, metonymy, irony. Theory showed how these figures aren't just decorations in poems. They are fundamental to how we think and argue, even in philosophy, science, or psychoanalysis. Freud's work, for instance, is full of narrative and rhetorical structures.
Okay, so if narrative and rhetoric are everywhere, then maybe the line around literature seems less crucial if you're studying narrative or rhetoric itself.
Precisely. It makes defining literature by its unique, inherent features really difficult.
And the source also points out the definition has changed over time anyway, right?
Massively. The modern idea of literature as primarily imaginative, writing novels, poems, plays, is relatively recent, maybe only about 200 years old.
Only 200 years. What was it before then?
Before around 1800, literature generally just meant writings or book learning or scholarship. It wasn't specifically tied to the imaginative or fictional.
So how people read, say, Virgil's Aeneid in 1750 would be different from how they read it in 1850.
Absolutely. The category it belonged to shifted. Culler traces the modern sense partly to German Romantic theorists and writers like Madame de Stael around the turn of the 19th century.
And even now, the definition is slippery. What counts? Does a really well-written piece of journalism count? What about song lyrics?
Right. And what about works from outside European traditions? Does the concept even translate smoothly? It's very hard to pin down essential properties.
Which leads to that idea. Maybe literature is just whatever society treats as literature.
That's a provocative thought the source explores. It brings in the analogy of the weed.
Yes, the weed analogy. Explain that again.
Is there some essential botanical property that makes a plant a weed? No. A weed is simply a plant that a gardener doesn't want growing in a particular place.
It's defined by context and purpose, not by its inherent nature.
Exactly. It's defined by social criteria. The analogy suggests literature might be similar, defined by shifting social and cultural conventions about what gets valued, taught, and read in a certain way.
So literature is just whatever gets culturally designated as such, placed on the literature shelf in the cultural garden.
It's a compelling argument, and convention certainly plays a huge role. But Culler pushes back a bit. Is it only convention? Or are there perhaps certain kinds of language use that are particularly well-suited to being treated this way?
So maybe some plants are just more likely to be considered weeds than others.
Sort of. The idea is that literature often involves language that invites or rewards a particular kind of attention.
This is the literary attention or poetic function idea.
Yes, it's about focusing not just on what information is conveyed, but on the language itself, the words, their patterns, their sounds, their ambiguities, how what is said relates to how it is said.
The source uses that Robert Frost snippet, "The secret sits."
Right. We dance around in a ring and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle and knows. If you heard that in casual conversation, you'd probably just be confused, maybe ask, what secret?
Yeah, what are you talking about?
But if you encounter it presented as a poem, your expectations shift. You start looking for patterns, maybe the contrast between suppose and knows, the rhythm, the imagery. You ask, what does the poem mean? How does this language work?
Your focus shifts from the speaker's likely intent to the language object itself.
Exactly. And the whole institution of literature publishing houses, reviewers, university courses creates a framework where readers approach certain texts, expecting them to reward this kind of close attention. Culler says the conventions of literature hyper-protect what linguists call the cooperative principle.
The cooperative principle.
Yeah.
That's the basic assumption in conversation that the other person is trying to be relevant and make sense.
Yes. In everyday talk, if someone is obscure, you might just give up. But with a text labeled literature, especially a famous poem, readers often tolerate immense difficulty or obscurity. They assume the complexity must be there for a reason, that it serves some communicative purpose, even if it's hard to grasp. They work harder to make it make sense.
So the expectation is set that the effort will be worthwhile.
Right. Which brings us back to the puzzle. Do special linguistic features make something literature? Or does the literary context make us look for special features and interpret language differently?
Chicken and egg.
Kind of. And the source suggests it's really both. Not any piece of language can function as literature. Culler dismisses reading the phone book or a chemistry textbook this way. The language has to be complex or structured enough to respond to literary attention.
It needs potential.
It needs potential, but that potential is only realized through the conventions that label it as literature and the specific kind of attention readers bring to it. You have to shift between these perspectives, language properties, and social conventions.
Okay, so it's a dynamic relationship. Given that complexity, what do theorists point to as characteristic features or effects of literature? Culler outlines 5 main points.
Yes, 5 key things often associated with literariness. First, foregrounding of language.
Meaning language draws attention to itself.
Exactly. It deviates from everyday speech, makes things strange, uses patterns. Think of Gerard Manley Hopkins's dense sound textures, Dapple-Dawn-Drawn Falcon, or just simple rhyme and meter. Rhyme makes you notice the sounds and rhythms in a way you usually don't. When language is framed as literature, we actively look for this linguistic organization.
Okay, foregrounding. What's second?
Integration of language. Different levels of language, sound, rhythm, grammar, sentence structure, word meanings, themes are brought into complex relationships. They might reinforce each other or create tension and contrast.
How does that work?
Think about rhyme again. It connects words by sound, but that connection forces us to consider the relationship between their meanings. Or the famous example from linguist Roman Jacobson, the political slogan, "I like Ike."
Okay.
Jacobson pointed out how the repetition of the Ike sound integrates the levels of sound and meaning. The form, sound repetition, reinforces the message, liking Ike. It makes the liking seem almost built into the language itself. Literature, Culler suggests, is where we particularly look for and exploit these kinds of integration.
Makes sense. Third point.
Fiction. Literature often creates fictional worlds, characters, events. It refers to possible worlds, not necessarily the actual state of affairs.
So its relationship to the real world is indirect.
It's indirect and becomes a function of interpretation. When Burns writes, "My love is like a red, red rose," we don't ask which specific rose. The poem's context as fiction opens up questions about what it's really about: love, beauty, representation itself.
Okay.
Fourth, literature as an aesthetic object. Its purpose is often seen as internal to itself, the quality of the experience it offers, rather than achieving some immediate external goal, like persuading someone or conveying specific information, though it can do those things too.
It's associated for its own sake.
Yes, and the pleasure we get from it is often linked to this self-contained quality. A good story is tellable, it feels worth it, just as an experience.
And the fifth point.
Literature as an intertextual or self-reflexive construct. Works of literature are often made out of other works. They, quote, allude to, parody, rewrite, and transform previous texts and genres. Part of being literary is this relationship to literary history, this awareness of its own status as literature.
So foregrounded language, integrated structure, fiction, aesthetic object, and intertextual. Those are characteristics we often look for.
Yes, features that enable a text to be treated as literature. But the source also discusses the broader functions literature has been seen to serve in society.
Right. Beyond just analyzing its features, what roles has it played?
Well, in 19th century Britain, for example, figures like Matthew Arnold saw literature as a kind of civilizing enterprise.
Civilizing.
As an alternative or supplement to religion, promoting empathy and fellow feeling across social classes, offering humanistic values to counter materialism. A way to cultivate sensibility.
Okay, a moral or social improvement function.
Yes. And, relatedly, a national function. Benedict Anderson argued that novels and newspapers helped create imagined communities, a sense of shared national identity among people who would never actually meet.
Reading the same stories helps people feel connected as part of a nation.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But literature has also been seen as having contradictory functions. Is it an ideological instrument that subtly reinforces the status quo?
How would that work?
By presenting certain social arrangements or gender roles as natural or inevitable, seducing readers into accepting them through engaging stories.
Was it dangerous?
Exactly. Does it promote questioning, dissatisfaction, even rebellion? Plato wanted to ban poets from his ideal republic for that reason. Novels have been blamed for making people discontented with their lives, filling their heads with romantic notions or revolutionary ideas. Think of the impact of a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin.
So it can either soothe society or stir it up.
It seems to have the potential for both. It can foster fellow feeling that discourages conflict, or it can cultivate a keen sense of injustice that fuels progressive struggle.
That's quite a range of functions.
It is, and Culler argues that asking what is literature is valuable for theory precisely because it highlights the specific reading practices. Literature encourages suspending judgment, attending closely to language, focusing on how meaning and pleasure are produced.
And those practices, as you said, can then be applied much more widely.
Exactly. They become powerful tools for analyzing all sorts of cultural texts and practices.
Which brings us neatly to the field that does just that. Cultural studies. Okay, so cultural studies, you mentioned it looks at, well, pretty much everything, not just high art.
That's the general idea, yes. Our source describes it as examining all forms of cultural production and practice. So yeah, professors might be studying advertising, soap operas, fan fiction, fashion trends, food culture.
Cigarette brands, the source mentioned.
Right, it's incredibly broad in scope. The idea is that all these things carry cultural meaning and are worth analyzing.
So in that framework, literary studies becomes just one piece of the puzzle. Studying literature as one cultural practice among many others.
In principle, yes. That's how cultural studies often positions itself. though, as we'll see, the relationship can get complicated.
Where did this very broad approach come from? What are its origins?
Culler points to a couple of key strands feeding into contemporary cultural studies. One is the work of the French thinker Roland Barthes, especially his book Mythologies.
Mythologies, what did he do there?
He took everyday cultural phenomena, wrestling matches, Citroën cars, steak and chips, detergent ads, and read them like texts.
Reading wrestling like a poem.
Kind of. He analyzed the underlying conventions, the signs, the codes, exposing the social meanings and ideologies embedded in them. He wanted to demystify things that seem natural by showing how they are culturally constructed sign systems or myths.
Okay, showing the hidden rules of culture. What's the other strand?
The other major route Culler identifies is British Marxist literary theory. Thinkers like Raymond Williams and Richard Hogarth.
What was their focus?
They were interested in recovering and valuing popular culture, working class culture, forms that had been largely ignored or dismissed by traditional literary criticism, focused on the established canon of great works. It was about doing cultural history from below, giving voice to marginalized experiences.
So valuing popular forms instead of just high art.
Exactly. And this British tradition connected with streams of European Marxist thought, particularly those analyzing mass culture.
Mass culture meaning.
Things produced by large-scale industries, film, television, pop music. Some European theorists, like those of the Frankfurt School, analyzed mass culture more critically, seeing it as an oppressive ideological force.
Oppressive how?
By positioning people as passive consumers, reinforcing capitalist values, justifying state power, kind of lulling people into conformity.
Ah, okay, so you immediately see a tension there, right?
A major tension. It's central to cultural studies, according to Culler. On the one hand, there's this desire to recover and celebrate popular culture as the authentic expression of the people, or of specific communities.
The view from below.
Right. And on the other hand, there's the critical study of mass culture as something potentially imposed on the people, a form of manipulation or ideological control from above.
So is culture bubbling up from the people or being rained down on them by corporations and states?
That's the million-dollar question. It leads directly to fundamental questions about agency. How much are people shaped, constructed, even manipulated by the cultural forms they consume? The term used is interpation, how culture hails us into certain identities or subject positions, versus how much are people active agents who take cultural materials, even mass-produced ones, and use them creatively for their own purposes, maybe resisting or subverting the intended messages, making popular culture out of mass culture, popular culture seen as a site of struggle, not just consumption.
That connects back to the idea of the subject being made, not just given.
Absolutely. And cultural studies, our source notes, has put a huge focus on identity, not as a fixed thing, but as something complex, often problematic, formed through various intersecting factors like race, gender, class, nationality, sexuality, especially group identities.
Okay, so given this broad scope and these internal tensions, what are the specific points of friction between traditional literary studies and this newer field of cultural studies?
Well, Culler suggests that in principle, there shouldn't necessarily be a conflict. They could enrich each other.
How so?
Cultural studies often uses analytical techniques derived from literary criticism, reading cultural artifacts closely. And literary studies definitely benefits from the cultural studies perspective, seeing literature as a cultural practice, among others, relating literary works to broader social discourses, understanding how they might reflect or resist the ideologies of their time. Theory itself has pushed literary studies in this direction anyway.
So the lines are already blurred.
They are, but arguments definitely arise. Culler highlights two main battlegrounds: the literary canon and modes of analysis.
The canon again. The list of great books.
Exactly. Cultural studies fundamentally questions the traditional literary canon. It asks, on what basis are these works deemed excellent? Doesn't that notion of excellence often just reflect the values and interests of historically dominant groups, usually white, male, European, upper class?
So they advocate for broadening the canon, studying previously neglected works.
Yes, or even questioning the whole idea of a fixed canon based on supposedly timeless excellence. They might analyze popular fiction or marginalized voices, or compare canonical figures like Shakespeare with less canonical contemporaries like Marlowe, asking how the canon got constructed, rather than just accepting it.
It challenges the foundations of literary value. What's the other point of tension? Modes of analysis.
Right. This is the worry, sometimes voiced from within literary studies, that its specific methods might get lost or diluted if it's simply absorbed into the broader field of cultural studies.
What specific methods are they worried about losing?
Primarily the practice of close reading. That intense focus on the specific details of a text, the language, the structure, the ambiguities, the nuances.
And the fear is it would be replaced
By what Culler calls symptomatic interpretation. That's where you treat the cultural object, whether it's a novel, a film, a TV show, primarily as a symptom or reflection of some larger social force, political configuration, or ideology.
So instead of analyzing how this specific novel works, you'd read it mainly to see how it reflects, say, anxieties about capitalism in its era.
That's the potential danger. The worry is that all works from a period might end up being read as symptoms of the same underlying thing, flattening the analysis, missing the unique complexities, contradictions, or artistic achievements of the individual work. It risks neglecting the specificity of the cultural object itself.
And neglecting those specific reading practices that literature encourages, like suspending judgment, focusing on how meaning is made.
Exactly. Those practices might get sidelined if the main goal is just to diagnose the social symptom. However, Culler also notes that this opposition might be overstated.
Why?
Because major theoretical movements like feminism and post-colonial studies have profoundly influenced both literary studies and cultural studies, often blurring these lines. And the choice to study, say, working-class culture in Britain wasn't just academic. It had a political edge against a certain notion of high culture defining national identity.
So the debates are complex. It's not just about Shakespeare versus soap operas.
No. Culler emphasizes distinguishing between the value of studying different objects. We can't assume one is inherently more worthy of analysis than the other, and the value in different modes of analysis. Close reading has its value. Socio-political analysis has its value. They can potentially complement each other.
So cultural studies, influenced by theory, really pushes us to think about how value gets constructed and institutionalized, challenging traditional boundaries.
Yes. Studying popular culture doesn't automatically mean the death of literature. It depends on how the analysis is done. It forces us to be more critical about our assumptions.
And whether we're analyzing a poem or a pop song, we keep coming back to those fundamental questions about language, meaning, and interpretation. Okay, so language, meaning, interpretation. These feel like the absolute bedrock for theory.
They really are. Almost everything else builds on how we understand these concepts. And Culler emphasizes just how complex meaning becomes, especially when we look at literature.
Not just one simple thing.
Definitely not. Think back to that Frost poem, The Secret Sits. There's the dictionary meaning of the words, the grammatical meaning of the sentences, the overall meaning or theme of the poem as a whole, maybe what the speaker in the poem means, maybe what Frost intended. It gets complicated fast.
And the crucial point from theory is that meaning isn't just located in one place. Not just in the text, waiting to be dug out.
Right, nor is it solely dependent on the author's original intention, locked away in their head.
So where is it then?
Many theoretical perspectives see meaning more as an event or an effect, something that happens in the interaction between the text's language, its structures, its context, the conventions it uses, and the reader who encounters it.
It emerges from the process.
Yes, and a foundational figure here, absolutely central to 20th century linguistics and theory, is Ferdinand de Saussure.
Saussure. What's his key idea about meaning?
His revolutionary insight was that meaning is based on difference.
Meaning based on difference, not on pointing to things.
Exactly. Our common sense view is that a word like cat means the furry animal because it points to or refers to that animal. Saussure turned this on its head.
How?
He argued that the meaning of cat comes not from a direct link to the animal, but from its difference from all the other words in the language system. Cat means what it does because it's not dog, not mat, not cat, not bat, and so on.
Its identity comes from what it isn't, within the whole system.
Precisely. It's defined by its negative relationships to other terms within the structure of the language. He saw language as a system of signs.
Signs. What did he mean by a sign?
For Saussure, each sign is a two-sided entity. It combines a signifier, the sound image or written form, like the sound Kate or the letters C-A-T, with a signified, the concept or meaning, the idea of a cat.
Signifier plus signified sign.
Correct. And the crucial property of this linguistic sign is that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary.
Arbitrary, meaning random.
Not exactly random, but unmotivated. There's no natural or inherent reason why the sound Kate should be linked to the concept of a cat. It's purely a matter of social convention within the English language. Another language will use a completely different sound, like gato or chat.
Okay, the link between sound and meaning is conventional.
Yes, that's the first level of arbitrariness. But Saussure went deeper. He argued that both the signifiers, the stream of sounds we can make, and the signifieds, the flow of concepts we can think, are themselves arbitrary divisions of a continuum.
What does that mean, arbitrary divisions?
It means that languages don't just invent different names for categories that already exist fully formed out there in the world. Languages actually create the categories by carving up the continuous reality of sound and thought in different ways.
Ah, like the example you gave earlier, English wood versus French bois and forêt.
Exactly. English uses one word, where French uses two to divide up the concept of wooded area. Or think about color spectrums. Different languages carve up the continuous spectrum of color into different basic terms.
So language isn't just a passive tool for naming a pre-existing reality.
No. According to Saussure, it's a system of conventional differences that actively organizes the world for us. It structures our concepts, shapes how we perceive reality.
Wow. That has huge implications for the relationship between language and thought.
Massive. The common sense view is that thought exists independently and language just comes along to express it.
Right, I have a thought, then I find the words.
But Saussure's view, and ideas developed from it like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, suggest something much more intertwined. Maybe language doesn't just express thought, but actively shapes or even determines the kinds of thoughts we can have.
Language provides the channels for thinking.
It provides the categories, the concepts, the structures. Culler suggests theory sees language as both manifesting ideology, the natural categories it presents, and providing the very site where we can analyze and question that ideology.
Okay. Now, within literary studies specifically, our source distinguishes between two main approaches to meaning and texts, borrowing terms from linguistics: poetics and hermeneutics.
Yes, this is a useful distinction.
What's poetics again?
Poetics essentially works from effects back to causes. It starts with known literary effects, like how a specific type of plot works, or what makes a passage feel ironic, or how a genre creates expectations, and asks, how are these effects achieved? What are the underlying conventions, codes, and operations of language that make them possible?
So it's trying to map out the system, the grammar of literature.
In a way, yes. It aims to describe what Culler calls literary competence, the implicit knowledge readers have that allows them to make sense of literary structures and meanings, reverse engineering the literary machine.
Okay. And hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics is basically the theory or practice of interpretation. It usually starts with the text, the signs, the forms, and tries to figure out what they mean. What is the meaning of this poem? What is this novel really about?
So poetics is how does it mean? And hermeneutics is what does it mean?
That's a good shorthand, yes. Literary studies often leans heavily towards hermeneutics because the meaning of literary works isn't always obvious. It often requires interpretation, but the two are related. Interpreting a specific poem, hermeneutics, might help you understand how, say, the lyric genre works in general, poetics.
And where does the reader fit into this? Our source mentions reception theory.
Right. Reception theory emphasizes that meaning isn't just in the text or the author's head, but emerges from the interaction between the text and the reader. The reader brings their own horizon of expectations, assumptions based on their historical context, their reading experience, their social position.
So different readers, or readers in different times, might find different meanings.
Exactly. A feminist reader today might interpret the sexual codes in an older novel very differently than its original readers, or differently than a text that seems to assume a male reader. Meaning becomes dynamic, dependent on the encounter.
What about the poor author's intention in all this? Does it count for anything?
It's a vexed question. In everyday conversation, we usually assume intention is paramount. But as we discussed, theory often questions its centrality in literature. Texts circulate, take on lives of their own. Culler suggests authorial intention can be considered as one possible context or strategy for interpretation, but it's not the final arbiter of meaning. And intention itself is complex. Is it conscious plan, or tied to unconscious desires, or shaped by the historical circumstances the author lived in?
It's not just a simple what the author meant. And speaking of context,
Context is crucial for meaning, but theory also shows that context is potentially boundless.
Boundless.
You can always invoke a broader or different context to change the meaning of the text. Think about Toni Morrison reading classic American literature through the lens of the unspoken presence of slavery, or Edward Said reading Jane Austen in the context of British colonialism. These theoretical moves radically expand the relevant context and thus transform how we understand the texts.
So interpretation is always open to new context, new questions.
Yes. Culler distinguishes between a hermeneutics of recovery, trying to reconstruct the original context and intention, and a hermeneutics of suspicion.
Hermeneutics of suspicion.
That approach seeks to expose the unexamined assumptions or hidden ideologies within a text, political, sexual, philosophical, linguistic. It reads against the grain, looking for what the text doesn't say or what its structures implicitly reveal.
So meaning isn't a fixed property. It's context-dependent, reader-dependent, potentially boundless, and always open to being reinterpreted.
Exactly. It's less a thing contained in the language and more an event produced by the language in interaction with everything else, like the meaning of that Frost poem emerging as you actively engage with its structure and possibilities.
And thinking about the structures within language, especially the figures of speech that are so prominent in poetry, takes us into rhetoric and poetics.
Right, we mentioned poetics, studying how literary effects happen, and our source links it very closely with rhetoric.
Yes, they're deeply intertwined. Rhetoric traditionally is the art of persuasive and effective speaking or writing. Sometimes it gets a bad rap, right? Like it's just empty words, fancy tricks, style over substance.
Historically, yes, it's sometimes been seen that way, mere ornament or manipulation, separate from truth or real meaning. But theory, Culler explains, has revived rhetoric in a broader sense.
How so?
As the study of the fundamental structuring powers of language, how figures of speech, argumentative structures, and linguistic forms actively shape thought, perception, and meaning, not just decorate it.
So rhetoric isn't just fancy talk, it's about the deep mechanics of how language works and persuades.
Exactly. And poetry is often seen as language that particularly foregrounds and utilizes these rhetorical powers, these figures of speech, for complex effects. Plato, famously, was suspicious of poetry precisely because he saw it as a powerful, potentially deceptive form of rhetoric.
Okay, so what are these rhetorical figures? We usually think of metaphor, simile.
Those are key ones, yes.
Yeah.
My love is like a red, red rose, simile, or my love is a rose, metaphor. They're often defined as departures from ordinary or literal language.
But did we just talk about theory questioning the whole idea of a purely literal language?
Precisely. That's a major theoretical intervention Culler discusses, particularly associated with Derrida and others. They ask, is there really a stable, purely literal level of language from which figures deviate? Or is language perhaps fundamentally figurative from the start?
How could language be fundamentally figurative?
Well, think about concepts we use all the time. We talk about grasping an idea or tackling a hard problem or the foot of the mountain. These are all metaphors, right? But they become so common, so ingrained, we treat them as literal.
They're dead metaphors, kind of.
Or just fundamental ways we structure our understanding. The argument is that figures might not be exceptions to the rule, but basic structures of thought and language itself. Literal language might just be language whose figurative origins we've forgotten or naturalized.
So studying rhetoric becomes crucial for understanding how we think and mean anything at all.
That's the claim. It's not just for analyzing poetry. Our source also highlights other key master tropes beyond metaphor. Metonymy. That's substitution based on association, like cause for effect, container for contain, saying you're drinking a bottle when you mean the contents, or the White House announced when you mean the administration.
Okay, association. What else?
Synecdoche, using a part to represent the whole, or vice versa, like all hands on deck, hands representing sailors, or the law arrived, police officers representing the legal system. It involves inferring a whole from a part.
And irony.
Yes, the gap between appearance and reality, saying one thing and meaning another, or having the opposite of what's expected happen. These tropes, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, irony, are sometimes called the four master tropes. Kenneth Burke argued they structure how we understand the world, even how we write history.
Wow, so these aren't just literary devices, they're cognitive tools.
Fundamental ways of organizing experience.
Yeah.
Now, shifting back to poetry more specifically, Culler talks about genres epic, drama, novel, but notes the particular rise and dominance of the lyric poem from the late 18th century through much of the 20th.
The short, often personal-seeming poem.
Right. Often seen as expressing intense feeling or a moment of insight. Modern poetry, in this vein, is often viewed as an experimental space for language, potentially disrupting conventional ways of thinking and seeing.
And the source brings up that idea of the poem as both word and act.
Yes, this is important for understanding lyric. A poem is a structure made of words, a text you can analyze. But reading or hearing it is also an event, an experience. And the poem itself often presents itself as an act of speech.
An act. Like the speaker in the poem doing something.
Exactly. And crucially, the voice speaking in the poem is distinct from the historical poet who wrote it. We infer a speaker, a situation.
John Stuart Mill called lyric utterance overheard, right? Like we're listening in on someone talking to themselves or someone else.
That's been a very influential model, yes. Seeing lyrics as fictional imitations of speech acts. My love is like a red, red rose. You may imagine someone saying this. But Culler points to the extravagance often found in lyric poetry.
Extravagance. How so?
Think about poets addressing things that aren't actually listeners. Like Shelley talking to the west wind, or Blake addressing a tiger, or Keats talking to a Grecian urn, or just using extreme hyperbole.
Yeah, you don't usually talk to the wind in everyday life.
Exactly. It's hard to see these moments as simply imitating ordinary speech. Culler suggests the act being performed here is often an imitation of poetry itself. It's a heightened, stylized kind of address.
And this extravagance is linked to specific rhetorical figures.
Yes, especially apostrophe, that act of addressing the absent, the dead, or the inanimate, like the wind or the urn. Also personification, giving human qualities to non-human things, and prospopeia, giving speech to inanimate objects or the dead.
These sound like the most poetical kinds of figures.
They often are. Culler argues that poetry's highest aspirations, its attempts to achieve the sublime or visionary, are often bound up with these devices. The very act of making such an address carries emotional intensity. It's an attempt to will something into being through language.
Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud.
Perfect example. That O of invocation, that direct address, is an attempt to achieve something, maybe even to constitute the speaker as a poet, as someone capable of this visionary connection.
But it's also risky, right? As you said before, it could just fall flat.
Totally. Cullernut's apostrophe is perhaps the most vulnerable figure, easily dismissed as rhetorical nonsense. Lift you as a wave, sure, pull the other one. Being a poet, in this view, involves the risk, the wager that these extravagant linguistic acts will succeed, will resonate.
So the poem, as an act, reveals both its ambition trying to make something happen and its constructedness, the fact that it relies on these verbal devices like apostrophe.
Exactly. It foregrounds the power and the artifice of language simultaneously. Culler also mentions Northrop Frye's idea that lyric often emerges from verbal patterning sound, rhythm, repetition, a kind of babble and doodle that produces charm or incantation before clear meaning solidifies.
The sound itself can affect thought. That's the scandal of poetry.
That's the idea, that rhythm and sound aren't just decoration, but can influence meaning and feeling. When interpreting poems, Culler reminds us of common conventions, looking for unity, exploring oppositions, like in the Frost poem, assuming significance, details matter, they might be objective correlatives for broader feelings or ideas.
He uses Ezra Pound's short Metro poem as an example.
Yes, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Interpreting this involves figuring out the relationship between the faces and the petals. Is it just a visual similarity? An equation? A contrast? Culler suggests seeing the faces as petals is itself an act of poetic imagination invited by the poem's structure.
So poetry is fundamentally an experiment with language, pushing the possibilities of meaning.
Yes, exploring how language can structure thought and feeling in new ways. Lyrics in particular are seen as explorations of poetics itself.
And just as lyrics explore poetics, novels explore narrative, how we make sense of time and experience through story. Narrative, okay, so we talked about poetry, but the novel really rose to prominence in the last couple of centuries.
Definitely. For many readers, it eclipsed poetry as the dominant literary form. And narrative theory explores something absolutely fundamental: how we make sense of the world, especially time and events, by ordering them into stories.
It's everywhere, isn't it? Not just in novels.
Absolutely pervasive. We tell stories about our day, we hear news stories, historical accounts, even scientific explanations often have a narrative structure. Frank Kermode's idea of TikTok: we need a beginning and an end to make sense of the middle. Kids develop narrative competence incredibly early.
So narrative theory tries to understand this basic human drive, make the rules explicit.
Exactly. It tries to articulate the implicit cultural knowledge we all have about how stories work, what makes them coherent and engaging.
What are the absolute basics for a story to work? Our source mentions Aristotle.
Going way back, Aristotle said a plot needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. There needs to be some kind of transformation or change, and the end should somehow relate back to the beginning, often resolving the desire or problem introduced at the start. It's not just a random sequence of events, but a meaningful order, often implying causality.
Okay. Now, narrative theorists break down narrative into different levels for analysis.
Yes, Culler outlines 3 key levels. First, there are events themselves, the raw material of what happened. We usually have to infer these.
Like the basic facts. A man met a woman, they fell in love, they got married.
Right. Second level is the plot or story. This is where those events are put into a specific sequence, often emphasizing causality and shaping them into a meaningful arc. A wedding, for example, could be the end of one plot, courtship, or the beginning of another, married life. This level is also inferred from
A third level, which is
the discourse. This is the actual telling, the way the plot or story is presented to the reader or listener. It's the words on the page, the arrangement, the perspective. This is what we directly encounter.
And the discourse is where all the complexity comes in, right? All the choices the teller makes.
Huge complexity. Narrative theory spends a lot of time analyzing the variables of discourse. A big one is who speaks.
The narrator.
Right. Is the narrator inside the story, first person I, or outside it, third person heshiti? If it's first person, are they the main character, a minor participant, or just an observer? If third person, are they anonymous or a developed character?
Okay, who speaks? What else?
Who speaks to whom? Is there an implied audience, a narrative within the story? How does the narration construct its ideal reader by what it assumes or explains? Feminist critics, for instance, have analyzed how many classic narratives seem to implicitly address a male reader.
Okay. Next variable.
Who speaks when? The time of narration versus the time of the events. Is the story told as it happens, simultaneous, right after, like in letters, or long after everything is over, most common? How is the order manipulated, flashbacks, flash forwards? How often are events told? Once, repeatedly. How much time is covered? Summary versus detailed scene.
Lots of temporal choices. And language.
Who speaks what language? Does the narrator use a different style or register than the characters? This leads to Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of dialogism, how the novel can stage multiple voices, discourses, social perspectives interacting with each other.
And finally, authority.
Who speaks with what authority? Narrators often claim authority, implicitly or explicitly. Reader, I married him. But are they reliable? Unreliable narrators give us clues to doubt their interpretation or their values. And self-conscious narration, where the narrator comments on the act of storytelling, deliberately plays with the problem of authority.
Okay, that's all about who speaks, but there's also who sees, right?
Yes, this is crucial. It's called focalization. It's distinct from who narrates, whose perspective, whose consciousness, whose viewpoint filters the events we see.
Do you have an example?
Culler uses Henry James's What Maisie Knew. It's narrated in the third person, but everything is focalized through the limited understanding of a young child, Maisie. We only know what she perceives, even if we as adult readers understand more than she does.
So the narrator isn't the focalizer there.
Correct. The focalizer can be the narrator, an omniscient narrator sees into everyone's minds, or a character, third person limited, or even first person narration where the I only sees their own perspective. Unreliable narration can often result from the focalizer's limitations or biases, not just the narrator's.
Wow, okay. That adds layers. So given all this complex machinery, what do stories do in the world? Why do we tell them?
Well, minimally, they circulate because they're tellable, as Culler puts it. They're considered worth it. They entertain, instruct, provoke, amuse.
And pleasure is often linked to desire.
Yes, narrative theory often connects plot development to the dynamics of desire, the desire for something to happen, the desire for resolution, and also to epistemophilia.
Epistemophilia, love of knowing.
Exactly. The desire to know secrets, to find out what happens next, to understand the truth behind events. Narrative often plays on this drive.
So stories give us a kind of knowledge.
They certainly can feel like it, a sense of mastery, of insight into human nature, seeing characters' hidden motives. But our source also notes narrative can police social norms. By showing characters whose aspirations get tamed, whose youthful illusions are crushed, whose desires ultimately have to adjust to social reality, think of the classic plot of formation or Bildungsroman. It can teach conformity.
So it can coach belief in social norms, but also maybe demystify them.
Yes, and it plays a huge role in identity, as we discussed. We internalize norms, explore possibilities, learn empathy, or fail to, through identifying with characters.
And they can be critical too.
Definitely. Stories are powerful tools for social criticism, exposing injustice, dramatizing the plight of the oppressed again. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a classic example of a narrative aiming for social change.
So is narrative fundamentally a way of knowing, of making sense? Or is it more of a rhetorical structure that persuades and organizes our perception?
That's a core question. Culler suggests that theory generally leans towards seeing narrative as a fundamental sense-making structure. Even critiques of narrative tend to rely on narrative structures themselves to make their arguments. It seems deeply ingrained.
It's how we think about time and change. And another way language structures reality is through doing things, through performative acts, performative language. This brings us to the philosopher J.L. Austin and his idea of speech acts.
Yes, a really influential concept. Austin noticed that we don't just use language to describe the world. Sometimes saying something is doing something.
Right. He made that distinction between constative and performative utterances.
Exactly. Constatives aim to describe a state of affairs, and they can be judged true or false. The cat is on the mat. Is it true or false?
Simple description. And performatives.
Performatives perform the action they name simply by being uttered in the right circumstances. They aren't true or false, but felicitous or infelicitous, successful or unsuccessful.
Like saying, I promise.
Perfect example. Or, I apologize, I bet, I declare war, I name this ship the Queen Elizabeth, I do at a wedding ceremony. The utterance is the act itself. Austin suggested a test. Can you insert hereby, I hereby promise, I hereby declare?
Okay, so you need the right words, the right person, the right context for it to work, for it to be felicitous.
Yes. Austin outlined various felicity conditions, appropriate circumstances, authorized persons, correct procedures, sincere intentions, though he later complicated the intention part.
But didn't Austin later blur this line between constative and performative?
He did. In his later work, he realized that even seemingly simple descriptions often have a performative dimension. Saying the cat is on the mat isn't just describing, it's performing an act of asserting or stating. And performatives like orders, stop, can be implicit. The distinction started to break down. He concluded that all utterances are speech acts involving doing something.
So how does this whole idea of performativity connect to literature?
It's been hugely important for literary theory. Why? Because literature is so much about what language does, not just what it says or describes.
Literary language as action.
Yes. Critics argue that literary utterances aren't typically making true-false claims about the existing world. Instead, they bring something into being. They create their own reality, their own effects. A poem, a novel, performs an act of creation.
So this defends literature against charges of being just frivolous or untrue.
It can be used that way, yes. Literature isn't making false claims. It's performing transformative language acts. It's doing something powerful.
And the focus shifts from intention again.
Right. Because the success of a performative act depends heavily on social convention, not just the speaker's inner state. If you say, I promise, under the right conditions, you've made a promise, regardless of whether you secretly intend to keep it. This resonates with literary theory's skepticism about authorial intention being the sole key to meaning.
So what makes a literary utterance felicitous? When does it work?
That's a great question. Culler suggests it's often when it comes off, when it achieves an effect, fits within the structure of the work, resonates with the reader. A literary work becomes an event when it's read and responded to, maybe like a bet isn't complete until it's accepted.
Okay, now Derrida engaged with Austin's ideas too, but critically.
Yes, Derrida challenged Austin's initial move of setting aside non-serious utterances, things said in jokes, in plays, in poems, as somehow parasitic on ordinary language use.
Austin thought performatives only really counted in serious real-life contexts.
Initially, yes. Derrida argued against this by focusing on iterability or citationality.
Iterability, meaning
repeatability.
Exactly. Derrida argued that a fundamental condition for anything to be language is that it must be repeatable, citable, capable of functioning in different contexts, detached from its original speaker or intention. If something couldn't be repeated, it wouldn't be a sign.
Okay, language has to be repeatable. How does that affect performatives? Derrida showed that performatives rely on this iterability. They work precisely because they're recognized as citations or repetitions of established formulas or social conventions. Saying "I do" works because it cites the conventional formula of the marriage ceremony.
So performatives function by quoting norms.
Yes. Their authority comes from citing prior acts, prior conventions. But here's the crucial Derridian twist. This very condition of possibility, citationality, is also what makes a purely ordinary, perfectly controlled context impossible.
How so?
Because if any utterance can be cited, it can always be lifted out of its intended context and function differently in a play, as a joke, ironically, or in ways the original speaker never imagined. Citationality means language can always break its contextual boundaries, leading to potential failure, misunderstanding, deviation, but also new effects, new meanings. Context isn't a fixed container.
That opens things up dramatically, and this line of thinking was picked up by Judith Butler.
Yes, very powerfully, particularly in relation to gender and identity. Butler's concept of gender performativity is a key example of applying and extending these ideas.
How does she use performativity for gender?
Butler argues, drawing on Austin and Derrida, that gender is not an internal essence or biological fact you simply have. Instead, gender is constructed and maintained through repeated, stylized bodily acts performed over time. Gender is what you do rather than what you are.
So it's a performance, like acting.
Not quite like putting on a costume. It's deeper and more compulsory than that. It's not a voluntary choice in the simple sense. Butler emphasizes that these repeated acts are citations of dominant social norms of masculinity and femininity. We learn to do gender by imitating and repeating the expected behaviors, gestures, styles associated with male or female.
So it's a social script we're constantly enacting.
Yes, and crucially, it's a script that constitutes our very identity as subjects. To be a recognizable subject in society often requires being gendered. Butler talks about being subjected to gender, but also subjectivated by gender. We become who we are through performing these norms.
It's not a single act, but endless repetition.
Compulsory repetition, often policed by social pressure. Butler calls it a forcible citation of norms. Think about the moment someone says, "It's a girl," or "It's a boy," at birth. Butler sees this as an initial performative act that assigns the child to a lifelong project of repeating and citing gender norms.
Wow, a girling or boying process.
Exactly. But crucially, drawing on Derrida's idea of iterability, this repetition is never perfect. There are always gaps, misfires, variations in how the norms are cited and performed.
That's where agency comes in.
Yes. For Butler, agency isn't about being outside the norms, but arises precisely within the process of repetition. The possibility of variation, of citing norms differently, slightly askew, opens up space for resistance and potential transformation of the norms themselves.
She also talks about insults, right? Like performative insults.
Yes. Take an insult like queer. Its power doesn't just come from the individual speaker's malice. It derives its force from citing a history of prior uses of that term as an insult, accumulating the weight of past oppression. It performatively constitutes the person addressed as deviant according to those norms.
But that citationality also allows for reappropriation.
Exactly. Groups can seize those very terms of abuse and recite them in empowering ways. "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," challenging and resignifying the norms through counter-citation.
So performativity becomes a model for understanding how identity, social norms, and even change happen through language and repeated actions.
It's incredibly influential. It shifts the focus from inner essences to outward practices and the power of convention. Culler notes the difference. Austin focused on singular acts creating reality. Butler focuses on the repetitive citation of norms creating identity and reality. It highlights the entanglement of convention and individual action.
It makes us think about the relationship between what language does and what it says.
That tension is always there. Performative theory offers a powerful lens for analyzing all sorts of social processes and even understanding contemporary events where the line between fact and performance seems increasingly blurred. Literary events, as acts of language, become models for thinking about cultural events more broadly.
This focus on how identity is performed and constructed leads us straight into the final big area, the theoretical debates about identity, identification, and the subject. Okay, so the subject, the self, the I. This feels like a huge philosophical can of worms that theory dives right into.
It absolutely is. Culler frames the modern debate around two fundamental questions that thinkers have wrestled with. First, is the self given or made?
Meaning, are we born with an essential core self, or do we become who we are through our experiences and actions?
Exactly. And the second question, is the self individual or social?
Is my self fundamentally unique to me, an internal thing? Or is it shaped primarily by my social roles, my group affiliations, my culture?
Right. And depending on how you answer those, you get different models of the subject. Theory, Culler points out, has generally tended to emphasize the made and social dimensions.
So the self isn't a pre-given essence, but something constructed.
Yes, constructed by forces that often operate outside our conscious, control the unconscious mind, psychoanalysis, economic class structures, Marxism, gender roles, feminism, language itself. The subject is seen as decentered.
Decentered, meaning not the stable, rational master of its own house.
Precisely. Not a fixed origin point, but more like an effect, a node where these various forces intersect. Remember that double meaning of subject we mentioned?
Yeah, being an agent, but also being subjected to power or rules.
Theory leans into that second meaning. To be a subject is, in many ways, to be subjected to these various regimes: linguistic, psychic, social, political.
Yeah, literature has always been obsessed with identity, right? Characters figuring out who they are.
Constantly. Novels and plays are full of characters grappling with questions of fate versus free will, individual desire versus social expectation, inner truth versus outward roles. Literature provides incredibly rich, complex explorations of these very questions theory tackles.
So literature provides the raw material, in a way.
It provides complex case studies. It often portrays identity with all its messiness, showing aspects that feel both given and constructed. A common plot involves the tension between a character's sense of their true self and the demands or limitations imposed by society.
But Culler notes a potential tension between how literature often handles identity and how theory does.
Yes, literature typically focuses intensely on the experience of the individual Hamlet's specific dilemma, Jane Eyre's unique struggles. Theory, while drawing on such examples, often aims to generalize about group identities or structural positions, the condition of woman, the experience of the colonized subject, the bourgeois individual.
Literature gives us particulars. Theory looks for patterns and structures.
Often, yes. Literature presents the singular case, but implies it's somehow exemplary. Jane Eyre's story feels like it tells us something about being a woman in her time, but the novel doesn't explicitly state the general rules. Critics and theorists then step in to make those generalizations explicit. Is Jane Eyre's predicament representative of women's oppression in general? How does her story illustrate the workings of class and gender?
There's also a critique mentioned that literature's focus on the individual might itself be ideological.
Right. The argument is that by concentrating so much on the inner life and unique struggles of an individual character, like Emma Bovary, the novel form might inadvertently construct an ideology of individualism that distracts from or downplays larger systemic social problems. It makes social issues seem like personal failings.
And literature doesn't just represent identity, it helps construct it for the reader, too.
Yes. Through the process of identification. When we read, we often step into characters' shoes, see the world from their point of view, experience their emotions vicariously.
And this shapes who we become.
Culler suggests so, quoting the idea that we become who we are by identifying with figures we read about. Literature provides models, scripts, ways of feeling and being that readers can internalize.
Which is why it's been seen as potentially corrupting, making people imitate unrealistic scenarios from novels.
Exactly. Think of Don Quixote. But it's also why literature has been championed as a way to cultivate empathy and sensitivity by allowing us to identify with others unlike ourselves. Theorists like Ian Watt argued the novel helped foster the very idea of a unique, inner, individual self.
So the novel form itself might have helped create the modern subject.
That's a line of argument, yes. And psychoanalysis offers a powerful theoretical framework for understanding exactly how this process of identification works to form identity.
Freud's ideas.
Yes. For Freud, identification is a fundamental psychological process. We build our personalities by identifying with others, parents, role models, assimilating aspects of them, being transformed by them. The Oedipus complex is all about identifications.
And Lacan, the mirror stage.
Lacan's famous concept of the mirror stage suggests that our sense of having a unified self originates in infancy when we first identify with a reflection in a mirror or in the mirror of our mother's gaze. We see a whole image and misrecognize it as our actual unified self.
So the self is founded on an image, an identification with something external.
Yes, and this identification is never complete, always somewhat alienated. The self is constituted by what is reflected back by others. Identity, in this psychoanalytic view, is built up through a series of partial, often conflicting identifications. It's never a stable, finished product.
Psychoanalysis even suggests identity is based on a kind of failure.
In a sense, we never perfectly achieve the ideal, like becoming the normative man or woman society expects. The process of internalizing norms always encounters resistance, gaps, contradictions from our unconscious desires and prior identifications.
And identification might even come before desire.
Some theorists, influenced by psychoanalysis, argue that, yes, a primordial tendency to identify with others might actually give rise to desire, imitation, and rivalry. We desire what the person we identify with desires.
Okay. This focus on identification also relates to group identities.
Definitely. Identification is crucial for building solidarity within social groups, especially marginalized ones. Shared stories, heroes, symbols provide figures for identification that foster a sense of collective identity. But again, the tension arises. Is that group identity something essential based on a shared origin, like race or nationality? Or is it something constructed through shared struggle, political alliances, and opposition to other groups?
Essentialism versus constructionism again.
It's a recurring debate. And Culler emphasizes that the central practical and theoretical problem is how to reconcile the theoretical critiques of fixed, essential identity with the very real psychic and political need for strong, stable identities, especially for emancipatory political movements. How can groups organize politically if identity is seen as fluid and constructed?
That seems like a major challenge.
It is. But theory also tries to identify pervasive structures in how identity works across different categories: race, gender, class, nation. Culler highlights a common pattern identified by thinkers like Althusser, Lacan, Butler, and others.
What's the pattern?
It's the idea that identity formation often works by taking an internal difference or division within the self or group, denying it, and projecting it outwards as an external difference between us and them.
Can you give an example?
The source uses the example of masculinity. To construct a coherent identity as a man often involves denying aspects perceived as effeminate within oneself and projecting those unwanted traits onto women, defining women as fundamentally different or other. Difference within is disavowed and turned into difference between.
So unified identities are often created by excluding or projecting difference.
Yes. The seemingly unified identity or role attributed to someone often creates a gap between that simplified label and the complex, contradictory reality of their lived experience.
If the subject is so constructed, so divided, what does that mean for agency? For responsible action? Can we still hold people accountable?
That's a huge point of confusion and debate. Culler offers a simple answer. Maybe it doesn't foreclose agency in the everyday sense. People still act, and acts have consequences, even unintended ones.
But there are more complex answers too.
Yes. Butler, for instance, argues that agency isn't the opposite of being subjected to norms. Agency is the process of iterative citation, the possibility of repeating norms differently. And others argue that if the subject includes unconscious drives and socially assigned positions, then our sphere of responsibility might actually expand to include structures and effects like systemic racism or sexism that we didn't consciously intend but participate in maintaining.
That's a challenging thought, taking responsibility for the system.
It is. Culler mentions Kwame Anthony Appiah's suggestion that maybe the debate about agency versus determination involves two different levels of talk that shouldn't be seen as competing causal explanations. Talk about agency helps us live intelligible lives with others. Talk about determination helps us understand large-scale historical and social processes. Maybe they belong to different kinds of stories.
Separating those levels might free up energy.
That's Appiah's hope. But ultimately, Culler concludes, theory doesn't really provide neat, harmonious solutions. It doesn't give final answers to what is meaning, or is poetry rhetoric.
It keeps the questions open, highlights the tensions.
Exactly. It presents us with tensions, paradoxes, conflicting perspectives, and asks us to keep thinking, to pursue these different lines of thought without necessarily expecting a final synthesis.
So the nature of theory itself is ongoing, unsettling.
Yes. As the source puts it, theory offers not fixed solutions, but the prospect of further thought. It demands that ongoing commitment to reading, questioning, challenging our own assumptions. It's fundamentally open-ended.
So we have taken quite the deep dive into literary theory today, using Culler's very short introduction as our map.
We certainly covered a lot of ground. And hopefully it's clear that theory isn't just some niche academic game about analyzing books.
No, it's much bigger. It's really a way of questioning common sense itself.
Right.
Pulling in ideas from all over the place: philosophy, linguistics, psychoanalysis.
To challenge what we think we know about fundamental things. Meaning, reality, language, culture.
Even literature itself. We saw how tricky it is to define, how its meaning might lie less in inherent features and more in how we approach it, the kind of attention it invites.
And how that literary attention, focusing on how meaning is made, can be applied way beyond poems and novels.
We explored how meaning seems to be based on difference, not just pointing, and how context is potentially boundless, always open to being expanded by new theoretical questions.
How narrative structures are understanding of time and experience, offering pleasure and knowledge, but also potentially policing norms.
And how our very identities might be less about some fixed inner core and more about the repetitive acts we perform, the way we cite and recite social norms, like Butler suggests with gender performativity.
Yeah, that idea of identity as something done rather than something been is quite radical, and it opens up spaces for thinking about agency and change within those repetitions.
Throughout this dive, we kept encountering these tensions, didn't we?
Absolutely. Tensions between the text as words and the text as an act, between narrative as knowledge and narrative as rhetoric, between the individual focus of literature and the social focus of theory, between identity as given and identity as made.
And theory doesn't necessarily resolve these tensions.
No, often it highlights them, asks us to hold contradictory ideas together, to keep thinking critically rather than settling for easy answers.
So the aim of this deep dive wasn't really to give you definitive answers about what theory is, but more to equip you with some new questions, new ways to think about texts, culture, and the world around you.
It's about becoming more aware of the hidden structures, the assumptions, the frameworks that shape how we understand everything. Seeing the theory embedded in our own common sense.
Theory, as Culler suggests right at the end, is this endless, ongoing conversation. It's tangled up with institutions, power, culture, and it's always pushing at the boundaries of thought.
So maybe the provocative thought to leave you with, the one that sums up the challenge and promise of theory, is something like this. If our common sense notions about reality and ourselves are just theories that have become invisible through habit,
and if our identities are constructed moment by moment through the repetitive citation of social norms,
then what new possibilities for understanding, for critique, maybe even for living differently, open up when we commit to that challenging, sometimes unsettling, but potentially liberating work of questioning everything we take for granted?
what assumptions are you ready to challenge next?
Something to ponder.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope it's given you plenty to think about.